The morning Diane Keaton's name began trending, something strange happened. Hollywood didn't react the way it usually does. There were no quick think pieces, no breaking news panels dissecting her legacy, no celebrity tweets trying to go viral. Instead, it froze. For one of the few times in its history, the world's loudest city fell quiet. It wasn't the silence between film takes or the hush before an award is announced. It was heavier than that, the kind of silence that only comes when the world realizes it's lost something irreplaceable. Diane Keaton, the woman who had spent over 5 decades redefining what it meant to be authentic, to be fearless, to be yourself, had taken her final bow. News broke early that morning. She had passed peacefully at her Los Angeles home, surrounded by family and a handful of close friends. For most people, that would have been the headline. But with Diane, it was only the beginning, because almost instantly, something happened. Something that said more about her than any obituary ever could. Across social media, fans began sharing their favorite moments. Clips from Annie Hall, that nervous laugh, that charming awkwardness, those little pauses that somehow made you feel she was thinking exactly what you were thinking. Scenes from The Godfather, where her quiet strength said more than 100 lines of dialogue ever could. And suddenly, timelines weren't full of hashtags or statistics. They were full of emotion. People weren't just mourning an actress, they were remembering a feeling. Diane had that rare ability to make you feel like she wasn't acting at all, like she was living every word, every breath right there in front of you. That's why her passing hit so differently, because when someone that real leaves the world, it feels like reality itself dims a little. But what truly broke the silence wasn't the news of her passing. It was the moment Al Pacino, her longtime friend, co-star, and one of the few people who truly understood her, stepped forward to speak. What he said that day wasn't rehearsed, it wasn't polished, and it wasn't cinematic. But it might have been the most powerful thing Hollywood had heard in years. Because in a city built on performance, Pacino didn't perform. He mourned. And that's when the world realized Diane Keaton's story wasn't over. It was just changing form. And as we look back at that moment, the one that left an entire industry speechless, we have to ask, what did Al Pacino reveal about the woman behind the legend? When Al Pacino arrived at the Dolby Theater that afternoon, there was no red carpet, no flashing bulbs, no fanfare. Just quiet. The kind of quiet that demands respect. He wasn't there to perform. He wasn't there to be Al Pacino the legend. He was there as Al, the friend. Reporters said he hesitated before stepping up to the microphone. His hands shook slightly. He didn't read from notes. He didn't prepare a statement. He just started talking. "A lion has fallen," he said softly. Diane wasn't just a performer. She was a force of nature. She didn't act. She lived every frame. And for a moment, even the wind seemed to stop moving. Pacino's voice cracked on that last word. Lived. And you could feel the decades of memories behind it. The laughter, the late-night calls, the long shoots under glaring lights, the quiet talks between takes. It wasn't an actor remembering another actor. It was a friend saying goodbye to someone who made his world brighter. What made the moment even more haunting was that Pacino rarely speaks publicly about emotion. He's famously private, a man who spent most of his career behind layers of roles and mystery. So when he opened up like that, raw and trembling, it felt like we were witnessing something sacred. And yet what he said next wasn't about passing at all. It was about life. He said she never chased it. Fame, money, perfection. Diane didn't care about any of it. She just wanted to feel something real. Those words cut through the noise of Hollywood better than any speech could, because everyone there knew that was true. Diane Keaton was one of the last few who didn't need to play the game. She didn't have a PR team crafting her every move. She didn't change her look to fit trends. She didn't hide her age or her quirks. She embraced them. And that's exactly why her passing felt like the end of something bigger than a single life. It felt like the end of an era where being different was enough. Pacino paused after his tribute. Some say he looked up toward the rafters of the theater, where old posters from The Godfather once hung during premieres. He smiled, barely. Then he whispered, "She taught us that honesty is the only art worth practicing." And that was it. No grand exit, no emotional crescendo. Just truth, plain and beautiful. For hours afterward, that clip spread across the internet. Millions of views within a day. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was human. And in that moment, it wasn't just Al Pacino mourning Diane Keaton. It was Hollywood remembering the kind of artist it used to celebrate. The ones who didn't need to shout to be heard. But to understand why his words struck so deep, you have to understand the connection that built them. A friendship forged in front of cameras, yet built entirely behind them. And it all began over 50 years ago, on a film set where two unknowns stepped into a story that would change their lives forever. Before Diane Keaton and Al Pacino were Hollywood legends, they were just two ambitious actors trying to survive the chaos of 1970s filmmaking. When Francis Ford Coppola cast them in The Godfather, neither of them could have predicted that their chemistry would become one of cinema's most enduring mysteries. On paper, they were opposites. Pacino, quiet, focused, intense, a storm behind calm eyes. Keaton, unpredictable, radiant, her words tumbling out like she was discovering them in real time. But when the cameras rolled, something happened. The air between them changed. It wasn't rehearsed. It wasn't forced. It wasn't even romantic in the traditional sense. It was real. Coppola once said that when Keaton looked at Pacino during a scene, it felt like she was seeing a person, not a character. That's what made their pairing so magnetic. It wasn't Kay and Michael. It was Diane and Al, caught in a moment of raw truth. Behind the scenes, their friendship blossomed quietly. They'd share long conversations between takes, not about fame or scripts, scripts, but about life, art, and why honesty mattered more than performance. Pacino was meticulous, always dissecting the psychology of his roles. Keaton, in contrast, chased emotion. She'd laugh mid-scene, forget her lines, improvise entire moments, and somehow it worked. That energy carried through the trilogy. Even when the story turned dark, their connection remained human. She once joked in an interview, acting with Al felt like standing next to a thunderstorm. You don't know what's coming next, but you feel alive. He later admitted that she grounded him. When I acted with Diane, I didn't have to try to be real, he said. She made reality happen. They never confirmed any rumors of romance, though tabloids tried endlessly. But the truth was far more interesting. Theirs was a love that didn't need labels. It was built on trust, shared vulnerability, and respect for each other's craft. When she laughed, he softened. When he grew distant, she brought him back to earth. Over the years, they worked together on and off screen, attending each other's premieres and supporting quiet causes away from the cameras. Whenever Pacino spoke about Keaton, his tone changed, more gentle, more personal. She wasn't just a co-star, she was his artistic equal, his compass in an industry that often lost its way. Their dynamic fascinated people because it refused to fit Hollywood's usual script. No scandals, no feuds, no publicity stunts, just two artists who understood that connection didn't have to be loud to be lasting. And maybe that's why when Pacino spoke at her memorial, every word hit so hard, because he wasn't eulogizing a colleague. He was mourning his creative mirror, the person who reminded him why he fell in love with storytelling in the first place. As the years went on, their bond became legend. Even younger actors who'd never worked with them talked about the Pacino-Keaton energy, that rare, unspoken rhythm that made every shared frame unforgettable. It's been said that some partnerships fade when the lights go out, but theirs? It only grew brighter with time, echoing through their films, their memories, and the silence that now lingers where her laughter once lived. And to understand why Diane meant so much to Pacino, to Hollywood, to everyone who ever watched her, you have to look past the glamour. Because before she became an icon, she was something much rarer, a woman who dared to be herself. Long before the Oscars, before the turtlenecks and the headlines, Diane Keaton was just a dreamer from Los Angeles, a young woman who didn't quite fit the mold. While others chased perfection, Diane chased truth. Born Diane Hall in 1946, she grew up surrounded by creativity. Her mother was a photographer, her father a civil engineer, and their home was filled with art, laughter, and music. But Diane was different. She wasn't interested in fitting in. She was fascinated by people who stood out. In the late 60s, when the world was loud with rebellion and change, Diane packed her things and moved to New York. She studied at the neighborhood playhouse, performing in small theaters and taking any job that kept her close to the stage. Friends say she was fearless, even when she had no idea what she was doing. She'd walk into an audition like she owned the room, one old castmate remembered, and somehow everyone believed her. Her first big break came in the Broadway production of Hair, a show that embodied the chaos and freedom of its time. But even in that wild ensemble, she stood out. Not because she tried to, but because she didn't. She wasn't polished or seductive or rehearsed. She was just honest. Hollywood noticed. By the early 70s, she was auditioning for film roles, including a quiet, complex part in a little gangster movie no one expected to succeed, The Godfather. And with that, her life changed forever. But what defined her wasn't fame, it was how she handled it. While other actresses reinvented themselves to match Hollywood's expectations, Diane doubled down on her oddities. She wore wide-brimmed hats when everyone else wore sequins. She laughed too loudly in interviews, interrupted herself mid-sentence, and showed up to red carpets in outfits no one else would dare to wear. She didn't perform femininity, she rewrote it. Then came Annie Hall in 1977, the role that would make her immortal. The oversized suits, the tie, the awkward charm. It wasn't a costume, it was her. The film won her an Oscar, but what it really gave the world was permission. Permission to be imperfect, to be weird, to be real. Even as fame surrounded her, Diane never joined the Hollywood race. She turned down roles that didn't feel right. She focused on projects that told the truth, no matter how unglamorous. She photographed abandoned buildings, collected old letters, wrote journals no one would ever read. She wasn't chasing the spotlight, she was documenting the light she already carried. And that's what made her different. She wasn't trying to be a legend. She became one simply by existing as herself. So when people heard she had passed, the grief wasn't just about losing an actress. It was about losing a mirror, someone who reminded us that authenticity doesn't need approval. But even as the world mourned, another story began to surface, one that revealed how Diane spent her final days, and the quiet beauty with which she said goodbye. Because true to her nature, even her farewell wasn't loud or staged. It was simple, private, and perfectly Diane. For someone who spent her life under the brightest lights, Diane Keaton's goodbye couldn't have been quieter. There were no paparazzi outside her gate, no publicists coordinating coverage, no endless tributes lined up in glossy magazines, just stillness, the kind she always said she loved most. In the final months of her life, friends say Diane had grown reflective, not regretful, content. She spent her mornings in her Los Angeles home, the same Spanish-style house she'd lived in for decades, surrounded by her journals, her photos, and her gardens. Those who visited her remember how peaceful she seemed, sipping coffee on the patio, sunlight filtering through the trees, her trademark hat resting on the table beside her. But beneath that calm was a quiet awareness. She knew her story was nearing its final chapter, and in true Diane fashion, she handled it with grace. Not denial, not fear, just acceptance. Close friends later revealed that she'd begun revisiting old old journals, flipping through handwritten notes from her early days in New York, and watching classic films with her children. She laughed often, sometimes at herself. One friend recalled her saying, "I've lived a million lives pretending to be brave. Maybe now I just get to be me." There were rumors, too, whispered through the Hollywood grapevine, that Diane had written letters to the people who shaped her life. Letters, not emails. Each one handwritten, sealed, and stored away in a small wooden box on her desk. No one knows exactly what they said. Maybe thank yous, maybe apologies, maybe one last bit of wit for those she loved most. Pacino was said to have received one. He's never confirmed it, but those close to him noticed something change after her passing. A softness in his tone whenever her name came up. Her family announced that her farewell would be private. No grand ceremony, no red carpet. Just a gathering in the hills, surrounded by the people who mattered most. There were wildflowers instead of roses, music instead of speeches. Her favorite song, "It's Too Late," played quietly as the sun dipped below the horizon. And though cameras weren't allowed, a few quiet moments found their way into stories shared later. One described a scene that could have been from one of her own films. The light fading, her children placing a single white hat, her hat, on the table beside her portrait. No headlines could capture that moment. No article could explain it. But those who were there said it felt less like an ending and more like a pause. The world holding its breath one last time for a woman who had spent her life teaching us how to be unafraid of silence. It was fitting, really. Diane Keaton had never needed applause to validate her art. She once said, "I don't perform for the audience. I perform for the truth." And even in her final act, she stayed true to that. Her farewell wasn't a production. It was a whisper, honest, human, and beautifully simple. But while she chose silence, the world did not. Because once the news broke, that quiet little farewell in the hills of California became the heartbeat of an entire industry. The day the world learned of Diane Keaton's passing, social media didn't just react, it exploded. But not with controversy or gossip, with love. Within hours, clips of her most iconic scenes began to flood every corner of the internet. That awkward, unforgettable laugh from Annie Hall. The trembling confrontation with Pacino in The Godfather Part 2. The radiant joy in Something's Gotta Give. Each clip carried new weight now. Every smile, every line suddenly transformed into something sacred. Celebrities, directors, and fans all joined in the chorus. Jane Fonda wrote, "She was the heartbeat of an era. Proof that being yourself is enough." Director Nancy Meyers called her sunshine wrapped in courage. And Al Pacino, through tears, simply said, "She made us all braver." Younger stars who'd grown up watching her, Florence Pugh, Emma Stone, even Timothée Chalamet, shared stories about how she'd shaped their understanding of authenticity. "She showed us that weird is powerful," one of them wrote. But the tributes weren't just from Hollywood. Everyday people, teachers, writers, mothers, students, flooded comment sections with memories of how Diane had inspired them. For some, it was her fashion. For others, her humor. But for most, it was her honesty. She wasn't trying to be perfect, and somehow that gave everyone else permission to stop trying too. Even institutions joined the wave. The Academy released a rare, simple statement. She taught us that vulnerability could be strength and imperfection could be art. It's rare for Hollywood to pause. It's a machine that never stops. Every tragedy replaced by the next headline. But for Diane Keaton, it did stop. For days. Because no one wanted to move on too quickly from someone who had made realness her art form. In Los Angeles, fans gathered outside the Dolby Theater, where her most unforgettable performances once premiered. They left hats, sunflowers, and handwritten letters, each one thanking her for something different. Confidence, loud laughter, freedom. And while the tributes kept coming, one truth began to emerge. Diane Keaton hadn't just entertained people. She had changed them. She'd made generations of dreamers believe that it was okay to stumble, to be awkward, to stand out. She turned imperfection into elegance and insecurity into style. That was her magic. She didn't hide her quirks. She wore them like armor. And as her photos flooded screens around the world, that mischievous grin, that signature hat tilted just slightly to the side, it became clear that Hollywood hadn't just lost a legend. It had lost its heartbeat. But even as the tributes poured in, one truth remained. Diane Keaton never needed the world's approval. She only ever asked for one thing, the freedom to be herself. And that's exactly what she left behind. A legacy that proved that the truest kind of beauty is the kind that doesn't fade when the spotlight does. They transition naturally from the industry's grief into the meaning behind Diane Keaton's life, closing with Al Pacino's final words and a reflection that lingers beyond the screen. For most of Hollywood, legacy means trophies, headlines, and fame. But Diane Keaton never measured success in awards. Her idea of legacy was something quieter, the kind that doesn't glitter but stays. Everywhere you look in film today, you can trace her fingerprints. The witty awkwardness of a rom-com heroine, the grounded honesty in a dramatic confession, the way modern actresses embrace imperfection. All of it carries a little of Diane's DNA. She made vulnerability fashionable. She made eccentricity aspirational. And more than that, she made being real something worth admiring. When she won her Oscar for Annie Hall in 1977, she didn't cry, she didn't boast. She smiled like someone who couldn't quite believe the world was paying attention. But in that humility was her power. She wasn't there to own the spotlight. She was there to earn it, moment by moment, through honesty. Even away from the screen, she was never idle. Few people knew that Diane was also a preservationist, quietly restoring historic homes across Los Angeles. She saw beauty in what others had abandoned. Old structures, fading memories, forgotten details. Maybe that's why her characters always felt so alive. She didn't just perform transformed them. She restored them, giving depth to things the world had overlooked. She also championed women in film long before it was fashionable to do so. On sets, she'd often advocate for younger actresses or behind-the-scenes creatives to get their chance. She believed art wasn't about hierarchy. It was about courage. Her personal journals, excerpts of which were shared after her passing, revealed a woman constantly at war with her own self-doubt, but also constantly choosing to keep going. Maybe bravery isn't loud, she once wrote. Maybe it's just showing up, even when you're terrified. And that's what people loved about her. She wasn't untouchable or perfect. She was human. She stumbled, she laughed at the wrong times, she said strange things in interviews. But that's why audiences believed her. She never hid behind the mask that Hollywood so often demands. You could say Diane Keaton didn't chase greatness. She redefined it, not through perfection, but through persistence, through the way she made truth feel cinematic. And in the end, that's what her legacy became. A reminder that authenticity outlives glamour, that kindness can be art, that being different isn't a flaw, it's a superpower. Even now, her influence lingers in unexpected places. A line delivery here, a costume choice there, a young actor talking about her bravery in an interview. It's almost like Diane never left. She just left pieces of herself in every artist she inspired. But perhaps the most beautiful part of her legacy wasn't written on screen. It was spoken softly, through tears, in a moment that silenced even the most jaded corners of Hollywood. Because when Al Pacino gave his final tribute, he didn't just honor a friend, he gave the world a final chapter in a story that refused to end. No one expected Al Pacino to speak again. He had already given his tribute at the Dolby Theater, raw, trembling, unforgettable. But a few days later, he did something no one saw coming. At a small private memorial held for close friends, Pacino stood once more. No cameras, no microphones, just a circle of people who had loved her. He looked around the room, his voice quiet, the kind of quiet that carries weight. "She used to tell me," he began, "that the best part of acting is pretending you're brave." He paused, then smiled faintly. But the truth is, she never had to pretend. The room fell still. He talked about the first time they met on The Godfather set, how nervous he'd been, how she'd walked right up to him and said, "Don't think so hard, just be." He said that single piece of advice shaped his entire career. Then he said something that later spread like wildfire online, retold by someone who'd been there. He whispered, "She's not gone. She's just taken her bow." It was simple, but the weight of it, you could feel it in your chest. In that moment, people realized that what Diane left behind wasn't just art or influence, it was presence. The kind that doesn't fade when someone leaves the room. It lingers, it hums in the silence, it waits in the flicker of a film reel. Pacino ended his tribute the same way Diane ended so many conversations, with laughter. Not a loud performative laugh, but the kind that feels like relief, like understanding. "She'd hate all this attention," he said, shaking his head. "She'd tell us to get over it and go make something honest." And maybe that's the real ending of her story. Not the loss, but the continuation. Because every person in that room left wanting to create something real, to live a little more honestly, to speak a little more freely. That's what Diane Keaton's life did. It didn't just inspire admiration, it inspired action. As the night ended, one guest described looking out over the Los Angeles skyline, the same city that once made her a star. The lights seemed softer that night, almost respectful. Maybe it was imagination, or maybe, just maybe, it was her final bow echoing across the hills. And so, as the world moves on, Diane Keaton's story remains, not as a headline, not as a trending topic, but as a feeling. Her films still play late at night on streaming platforms. Somewhere, someone laughs at her nervous smile in Annie Hall, or watches her confrontation scene in The Godfather and feels that strange, beautiful ache of truth. Somewhere, a young actress studies her work and realizes that imperfection isn't something to hide, but it's something to honor. That's how Diane lives on, not through marble statues or plaques, but through the spark she left in others. Hollywood will make more stars. It always does. But it may never again produce someone quite like her. Someone who could make you laugh, break your heart, and teach you something about yourself all in a single glance. Because what Diane Keaton gave us wasn't just performance. It was permission. Permission to be awkward, to be bold, to be real. And maybe that's why her story feels less like an ending and more like an invitation. A reminder that we all have a little Diane in us if we're brave enough to show it. As Al Pacino said, she's not gone. She's just taken her bow. And somewhere behind that curtain, you can almost hear her voice, laughing softly, tipping her hat, ready for whatever scene comes next.